Awesome. So hello, everybody, and welcome to June's Tenant Talk Live. And again, you can still feel free to drop your name in the chat. My name is Sid Betancourt, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the Coalition. You're currently joining Tenant Talk Live, just so everybody knows you're in the right place. And we provide opportunities for tenants and residents to connect with one another and with NLIHC so that we can learn from each other, share best practices, and be more involved in influencing federal housing policy and how to take that back to your communities and lead in your communities. Today, I'll begin by providing just some general policy updates, and then I'll introduce our guests who are speaking on public housing advocacy. So we'll learn a little bit about the work that the Human Rights Watch is doing, and also we'll get perspective from some folks in NYCHA with an organization called Save Section 9, and then some historical perspective from Boston public housing. So we have a little bit of variety in there. And I will say that we'll be covering a lot of content today, so we'll likely go over about 5 minutes or so, and we'd welcome you all to stay if you're available, but of course, that's all up to you. We don't really, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you want to hop off at 7, the recording will be available to you afterwards. So again, before I get started, I'll just go over some of the basic logistics that I cover every time, but the session is being recorded, as you heard at the beginning, and it'll be available on YouTube later this week. If you have any questions, I please ask you to use the Q&A feature, because that'll make it a lot easier for us to streamline those questions. But please feel free to use the chat to share your thoughts. And I'll be sending a follow-up email with the notes, the recording, the chat, and any other resources that are shared with us today in the coming days. And we'd also love to invite some folks to come off mute from the audience as well. Like I said, there's going to be a lot of content today, so I'm going to try my best to get folks off the mute, but if I can, I apologize in advance. And now I'll go ahead and provide a brief policy update, because I know a lot of folks here attend some of our other calls, so this information might be a little bit redundant, but it's important for all of us to know. So I'm sure for housing advocates who follow a lot of our work, you might have heard that we've said that Senator Chuck Schumer and Senator Joe Manchin are having several meetings, kind of one-on-one, talking about what a new reconciliation package could look like. And they're scaling it down from the original like 1.75 trillion, I think it was, in investments in the Build Back Better Act. And so Democratic lawmakers are kind of working together now, hopefully, to get an agreement on a reconciliation outline by July 4th or before that holiday break, so that they can pass it through both the House and Senate chambers before Congress goes on recess in August. So this is a very short timeline, and it's very timely for us to, again, kind of revamp our efforts towards the reconciliation package. And so tomorrow, on June 7th, we will be hosting, or NLIHC will be hosting, a national call-in day and Twitter storm from starting at 1 p.m. Eastern time to urge Congress to include NLIHC's top priorities in any reconciliation package. And to save some time, I'm just going to drop those priorities in the chat. So I want to make sure that we have time for our awesome guest today. And so we have a few resources that you all can use tomorrow. We do have our typical like email platform that you can use so that you can email your members of Congress. We also have a call-in script, and we've updated our Build Back Better toolkit. It's more of a reconciliation toolkit now, so feel free to use any of the resources in there. In addition to the reconciliation work that we're doing, we're also continuing our efforts on the 302B letter that we're doing alongside the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding, also known as CHCDF, to demand that Congress provides the highest amount possible for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs in the FY23 budget. So again, Courtney will share the link to do that advocacy in the chat shortly, and I'll also share those priorities in the chat for the sake of time. Oops, hold on a second. I clicked the wrong button, but we're used to technical difficulties in the digital age. Cool. So that's in the chat for you all. And again, all of these resources will be shared after the webinar as well. And welcome to everybody who just joined us in the last couple of minutes. So now I will take some time to introduce our panelists for today. This lovely Monday evening evening afternoon will be joined by Jackson Gandour from the Human Rights Watch. He's a researcher. We'll also be joined by Ramona Ferreyra, who's an advocate with Save Section 9. And we also have one of our board members, Mrs. Lorraine Brown, who's a resident board member with NLIHC. But to start us off, I'll let Jackson begin, and I'll share my screen shortly so that he can share his presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Annie, for the introduction. Let me pull up my little presentation. So yeah, I was going to talk really briefly about a little bit on Human Rights Watch's work on housing, but mainly just an overview of human rights standards on housing. Okay, now things have gone awry. Sorry, I got to find the thing that I was just trying to share. I just had it when I tested it.
I'll have it up too in a second if that's easier.
Yeah, that can help. I don't know why it disappeared now. Okay, perfect. I think everyone can see. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So yeah, I'm a researcher at Human Rights Watch in the Economic Justice and Rights Division, and I focus on housing policy, particularly in the US, and done a lot of research on public housing. And so I just want to talk a little bit about sort of international law and housing funding. And I guess we can go to the first slide or the second slide. Perfect. So yeah, as everyone here knows, housing is a human right. And in this case, it's protected by essentially every major human rights convention. And I guess I just to clarify from the outset that this isn't to preclude, like I'm focusing on sort of UN conventions and the case law that's developed under them, but this doesn't preclude other groups, particularly social movements, tenants, advocates, and organizers from developing their own conceptions of human rights and housing rights in particular. And there's, this sort of doctrinal case law is not more valid than those other conceptions of human rights, but this is what I'm presenting on here. So yeah, as this slide mentions, basically every major human rights convention protects the right to housing. The one I'll be mainly focusing on is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which protects what's called the right to adequate housing as part of the general right to an adequate standard of living. One thing to note about these is that the U.S. does not like to ratify human rights treaties. It has signed all of these treaties, but it's only ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which does expressly forbid racial discrimination in housing, and has actually stronger standards than you'll find under domestic law. But we have signed all of these treaties, and what that means under international law is that the US is still obligated to refrain from any actions that would undermine what's called the object and purpose of the treaty. And so I guess we go to the next slide. And so, yeah, the right to adequate housing has been sort of developed under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights by an expert body in the UN that's sort of tasked with interpreting these things. I mean, what I have here is the sort of 7 main components of the right to adequate housing. And they're pretty straightforward, what you would expect: affordability, habitability, location with access to employment, schools, et cetera. The one I actually wanted to focus a little bit on is legal security of tenure. What that actually means is that occupants must have legal protection against what's called forced eviction. In that case, that itself is defined as eviction without access to appropriate forms of legal or other protection. And what's interesting about that standard is that even if an eviction is carried out lawfully under domestic law, human rights law requires that no eviction place any individual at risk of homelessness or other violations of human rights. That could also be things like the right to health. So it's very important for sort of COVID eviction moratoriums at the time. And actually the case law developed under that standard actually requires judicial authorities to carry, before any household is evicted, to carry out an analysis of the proportionality of the legitimate grounds for the evictions against the actual impacts on the individual. And again, if an individual is at risk of homelessness or another violation of human rights, the eviction is per se unlawful under human rights law. I'm not aware of any US jurisdiction where that is the standard. We go to the next slide. The next thing I sort of want to talk about is what human rights law says about government spending. And like any other economic right, governments have an obligation to take steps to progressively realize the rights, and they have to be taking actions in accordance with what's called maximum available resources. And essentially, you can sort of translate that to GDP or the size of an economy. But what that also means is that governments can't just say there's not enough money in the budget for something, right? They have to be showing you that they're actually taxing at a sufficient rate, that they're actually doing other means to raise revenue, because they're obligated to do that to fulfill rights, in this case, the right to housing. And the second sort of corollary of that is that any budget cuts, so-called retrogressive measures, are presumptively unlawful and have to be fully justified, which is very hard for a rich country like the US to do. The charts that you see on the right of this slide show declines in public housing funding since 2000. The blue bar is capital funding. The pink bars are operating fund shortfalls. And then below that is all housing outlays as a percent of GDP since 1995, which is also trending downward, which is the opposite that what you'd want to see under human rights standards that call for the opposite, to again progressively realize the right to adequate housing in accordance with the maximum available resources. And if you're spending less as a percentage of GDP, that sort of flies in the face of that standard. And then I guess go to the next slide. And a few things that are interesting about the US in an international context is basically we have, as a percentage of all rental homes, we have far fewer what are called social rental homes than the OECD average, which is about 7% of all rentals in the OECD or social housing. In the US, that's about 3.5%. Social housing in this case, using the sort of common definitions, is a broader term than public housing. It would even include things like tax credit housing, which as people know is not as affordable as public housing or even project-based Section 8 housing. But the US certainly has less social housing than most other rich countries. And then the final slide. Which also does something else that's interesting is that we're really an outlier in this case, is that essentially the US is the only country, only rich country that I could find data on where the majority of its social housing stock, its affordable housing stock, is actually owned by for-profit providers. Quite an outlier in the world. And under international law, states have a lot of discretion in how they actually fulfill human rights. There's not some right way to conduct housing policy. But looking at this, it's important that insofar as these sort of features of our housing policy pose a risk to security of tenure and long-term affordability, they do raise human rights concerns. It's particularly relevant given opt-out risks in tax credit housing or in project-based Section 8 housing. And it's sort of my view that the sort of relative stability and long-term affordability that's ensured by public ownership, which is what makes public housing such an important part of a human rights-based housing strategy. The main issue is that, as our next speakers will attest to, the US has consistently decided to underfund it. I hope I didn't go over on time, but if there's time for questions, Sydney, let me know.
Okay, we do have a few questions that came in the Q&A and the chat, so I'm going to do the Q&A first. We have a question from Amber Smith asking a really good question, and I think especially since you noted that the US hasn't ratified some of these international policies, what can rural Americans use as reference when they talk about those in the legislation around affordable housing?
Yeah, that is a really good question. I mean, first I would mention that even though we have ratified first the covenant on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, which does specifically discuss discrimination in housing. And again, the actual case under that is a little more progressive than under US law. So that's one point of contact. I'd also note again that even though we haven't ratified some of these treaties, we have signed them. And so we are obligated to not take actions which are contrary to the object and purpose. And I think there's a strong argument, given the housing crisis in the United States, particularly the amount of underfunding of things like public housing, in particular conditions people are facing, there's a strong argument that they're violating that obligation as well. But it's a good question. I know that in some cases, I think some cities have particularly they can't officially ratify something, but they sort of adopt language, sort of adopting human rights standards. And I do think that is also a kind of touchstone for places outside of major cities and in rural America as well.
Oh yeah, most definitely. There's another question here from Karen Rhodes talking about how public housing is being converted to LIHTC housing and then privately owned LIHTC housing. So when that happens, what protections are actually remaining for tenants when it gets converted to LIHTC?
Well, it depends on the program. It depends on how it's being converted. But if it's just I've seen this happen. If it's just a demolition and then convert to LIHTC housing, very few. I mean, I know the LIHTC program has some protections, but the rents, if it's just become pure LIHTC housing, the rents will no longer scale with income. They won't have the same access to grievance proceedings and eviction protections that public housing tenants do. And then, of course, in 15 years time, it's at risk of not even being LIHTC housing anymore. It could go to something even more expensive. I mean, the main issue is that, in my research, you see this, you'll see public housing that's dilapidated across the street. You'll see a LIHTC development that looks much newer. You'll dig into it and go, what are the income? What are the rents set at? And they're set at levels that, while sort of more affordable than market rate housing, certainly is just not affordable for the vast majority of public housing tenants. And so if it would result in them losing their home or access to an affordable home, it certainly poses human rights concerns. In fact, it's be a violation of human rights in that case.
Oh yeah, most certainly. I think we have time for one more question before we move over to Ramona's section, but Jackie in the chat mentioned, how do you bring the ICESCR within eviction court?
So I have to concede I'm not, I cannot give legal advice. It's a good question. I do know, unfortunately, we haven't ratified it. And if we have ratified it, it is not self-executing. That's a fancy word for me. You can't go to a court and say they violated my covenant right in this case. I actually think there's some advocacy that can be done here. I know the National Income Housing Coalition has called for the US to ratify the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. I also think another important one is the optional protocol to that convention. The sort of case law around evictions that I was gesturing at is actually brought under a separate sort of sub-treaty called the optional protocol that allows individuals who think their rights are being violated to actually petition that case to an international body. And the enforcement is not maybe going to be ideal, but it is at least for one, developing human rights standards. It does, the country is obligated to respond and at least say how they're addressing what the committee says. And a lot of that really strong language about procedural protections around evictions comes out of that sort of case law. So I think adding particularly optional protocol ratification to calls for the US to just ratify the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights is sort of an interesting possibility, even if it seems remote at this time.
I was gonna say too, if you have access to that language, I know it might be a lot, but if you could share it with us, I think it might be useful.
Yeah, I can do a quick Google off screen. And
yeah, I was like, I can't.
Sure.
I'd definitely like to share it afterwards too, if you don't have time right now. But I'll go ahead and move forward with our next panelist. Thank you so much, Jackson. We'll go ahead and move on to Ramona Ferreyra now. And before I bring her on, I do want to show a video in which Ramona is featured that she did with the Human Rights Watch alongside Jackson. So really quickly, I'm just going to share my screen one more time. Well, actually a second time because I'm going to share my screen again. But we're going to watch this video really quickly. And let me know. Oh, actually, hold on, because I need you all to hear my sound. And I can't do that unless I...
Sadly, it's been about a decade that we started seeing that something was wrong with public housing.
Are you all able to hear the video or just...
I can hear it, the video. I hear Ramona talking and the music.
Okay, but you can't see it? Okay, hold on a second. Let me fix this really fast. Technical difficulties, like I said, are sometimes unavoidable, but that's okay. Okay, I think I got it now. All right, yay. Can y'all see that now? Hopefully this works.
Yes, I can see it. It's on the
We
screen.
love our community and we love living here. Sadly, it's been about a decade that we started seeing that something was wrong with public housing. Public housing is a congressionally established housing program that does housing at 30% of your income. It was created because there was a recognition that we have a shortage of housing that was affordable. When Grandma first moved in about 37 years ago, this place gave her financial liberty again to make whatever decision she wanted and to actually have savings. I would come here a lot throughout elementary school. The building was in great condition. There was a community center. So this was like my favorite escape. For the last 30 years, Congress hasn't been giving public housing what it needs to operate. And the housing authorities, like New York City Housing Authority, eventually they stopped taking care of the actual buildings. After I moved in, I would start to slowly try to get things fixed. The floors started coming up because of the water. You're constantly told that none of these things can be done because there's no money. My apartment's in pretty good shape because I put so much work into it, but I paid out of pocket. And I had people help me. If people don't have that or can't physically find people to do it for them, especially in a senior building, it completely falls apart. Ramona, ¿dónde está la escandalosa?
Sí, yo llamé a los bomberos. Uno vaya y no arreglan nada, que vaya, llamo y no viene. Voy, ahí nadie habla español. A mí personalmente me hace daño. Una gente que está enferma sufre de corazón y de todo.
It's like every year, all the officers come around looking for votes. And then we have to select them. And then when the issues comes, like right now, they don't care. We don't want to be forgotten. That's the main thing.
I decided to launch Safe Section 9 because so few people understood that it's a federal program. Section 9 was different because Section 9 actually looked at what does a community need to thrive. So they provided resources, outreach, counselors, and that's the fight. The housing authority saying, well, we'll just go private. And when we privatize, it'll be better. But there's a loss of accountability when you privatize. We have to find a way to prioritize housing people that are the most vulnerable, financially vulnerable, and physically vulnerable in a just way. When we ask ourselves, like, what does Congress need to do to change things and to take us back to the vision of public housing in America, where our apartments are completely habitable and safe, our infrastructure is replaced and becomes sustainable. In order for us to get there, Congress has to recommit to the importance of housing.
Well, thank you so much to Ramona for being part of that video and for joining us today, Ramona. I really appreciated hearing your story and the story of the other folks as well, the work that you are doing. But was there anything else that you'd like to add? I know you wanted to share some history of the public housing as well, if there's anything additional that you'd like to say.
So one of the things that I think is appropriate to highlight is how public housing tenants in New York are actually fighting back with the support of Safe Section 9. So I actually have a set of national demands or collective solutions that we've come up with. And I thought that sharing those with you guys for like 2 minutes would be helpful as we frame the fight for low-income housing, because so often public housing is overlooked. So let me open up the demands. And if you guys have any questions as we move along, definitely drop those in the chat. So these were developed over the last 2 years. Safe Section 9 was created because I recognized that we needed to be holding Congress accountable. So we have a set of demands at the national level and then every city. So the first one is that we want there to be a complete moratorium on the privatization of RAD, PACT, or any programs using Section 18. Then we want them to actually do an impact study. So the work that Jackson has been doing and some tenants have done here in Brooklyn, New York, tells us that, and Queens, tells us that these programs are not working and that they're not the solution. So we should be actually measuring their success. Then we want them to democratize the process by which Section 18, demolition or turning something obsolete, is actually applied. And the reason why this is important is because in housing authorities, they have fallen into a pattern of not repairing the units in order to make them obsolete. And obsolete means to HUD that this unit should not be inhabited by a human being. So they then turn around, Congress and HUD, and issue us a tenant protection voucher, which is literally protecting the tenant from the home that they have abandoned and allowed to fall apart, right? So it's really ironic the way that they've been hurting our communities. Then we talk about issuing a national state of emergency because we want oversight and clarity and responsibilities. And we don't believe that we can get that under our existing housing authorities. Then we're asking for the states and states and federal support in actually making sure that tenants continue to participate in the decision-making process of public housing authorities, which is another right that we have under Section 9. We're asking here for 100 billion for Section 9 nationally. That's 1 million households that would benefit from this. And the minimum that we need based on all the research that's been done is at least 80. Then we're asking for 10 billion in annual investments. And all of this is coming from the federal government. We're then looking to restore public housing stock back to 1999 numbers and eventually repealing the Fair Cloth Act. We want components of the Green New Deal for public housing to be incorporated into the legislation. And one of the things that we found that was really disappointing was even in Build Back Better, there was language that was clearly racist. So in the teachings that I've developed, we actually start with the myth of the welfare queen. And we demonstrate to tenants that this belief that everyone in public housing is lazy, not working, living off the system, is what has caused over the last 30 years our conditions to completely deteriorate. We have a couple new demands that have come up in this week because we're currently doing lobby training to take folks out to Washington, D.C. And some of that includes, allowing Section 9 tenants to build their credit by actually reporting our rent to credit agencies. And then we are really not satisfied with the current use of the word affordable housing. Public housing being capped at 30% makes it the only affordable housing in the United States. So we're going to try to get some clarity at the federal level. And a wild wish would be if all affordable housing was capped at 30% of your income. I think my dog thought that my time was up. I don't know where I'm at with time, Sid. Let me know.
No
And
worries at
then-
all.
Okay, so each city is also making a set of specific demands for themselves. And these are going to be presented, I'll stop sharing. These are going to be presented to our elected officials in DC next week. So we head down to Washington, DC on the 13th. We're going to be there the 13th to the 14th. We've got 80 tenants coming from New York City, Memphis, Minneapolis, and I'm forgetting one city, but I will remember them. And we have been doing lobby trainings now for a week and a half, preparing tenants on how to have that conversation with their elected officials and giving them the background and the resources that they're going to need for us to be successful. So I'll check the chat to see if there are any questions.
I love how your dog wants to join in too.
Yeah,
They
I have to sit here so he'll fall asleep and he still is not satisfied.
No, it's okay.
So I don't see any questions. So like I'll be around if you guys think of anything. Public housing, our email, I'll drop that in the chat. It's safesection9@gmail.com. And you can also find us on Facebook at Safe Section 9. It's a group that we have. I'll type that in. And we are always looking for supporters, allies, volunteers to get our work done. But we spend most of our summer and evenings doing teach-ins around New York City or on Zoom to educate everyone on public housing.
Well, thank you so much, Ramona, for sharing that information and that context as well. I don't see any questions either, but I do see some kudos in the chat. We do have a question from Leon asking how we can participate or how folks can participate in the Capitol Hill visits next week.
So a good way to participate would be if you live in another city or you live in one of the cities that's being mentioned. So North Carolina, Memphis, Minneapolis, New York City are the 4 that we have represented as of now. We would love to have specific demands or collective solutions to present to our elected officials. We presented that list of demands that you guys saw, except the last 2, to Chuck Schumer back in March. So now we're going to be updating him and presenting the whole argument regarding the funding as well. So if you want to help us and lean in towards Capitol Hill, you could submit demands from your city in order for your city to have a voice in our meetings, because we'll be presenting everyone's demands out there. Then I see we have a connection in Chicago. I had been in discussions with the National Museum for Public Housing. Haven't really made connections that really represents public housing tenants there. But one of the folks that's coming with us to DC, she's a documentary maker. And she's spoken to a couple of people from DC that were displaced by Cabrini Gardens. So we're hoping to continue that relationship via that path. But we would love to connect with public housing tenants all around the country and really bring this attention, bring attention to this issue.
No, for sure. And I definitely am really excited to see like the enthusiasm in the chat as well of folks wanting to get more involved. So definitely connect with Ramona, folks. Her email is in the chat and we'll share it in the follow-up email as well. So you have that available to you all. There is a question in the Q&A, Ramona, if you just want to type that question, that answer out, and then we'll move forward to Mrs. Brown just so that we have time for her presentation as well. But thank you so much, Ramona. And now I'll move to Mrs. Brown and I'm going to share my screen. So apologies if I don't see the question and answer tab or the chat, but I'll try to keep both of them open.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Sid, for allowing me to participate this evening. And thank you, Jackson and Ramona, for your empowering and informative presentations. I found them very, very effective. I wanted to present an historical accounting of NYCH's Section 8 program. Unfortunately, during 9/11, all NYCH's windows were blown out and the historical data that was stored on its mainframe was lost. Section 8 at NYCHA has always been treated as a stepchild. Their portfolio consists of 235,000 Section 8 residents. I spoke to their interim COO, Mr. Sherrod, last Thursday, and we're going to have a one-on-one to establish a CCOP Section 8 type of organization so that we can be included in the decision-making, since the transformation for change, the blueprint, has been approved by the Assembly, and things are going to be converted to RAD and PAC. Now, as you know, as Ramona had explained, the trust is a public benefit corporation designed to take over and restore distressed developments with richer federal funding than public housing or RAD converted developments now receive. The trust, or plan, if you will harm the NYCHA residents. And that is why it is important for us to stop NYCHA and other PHAs from moving forward. And in my presentation, I have chosen to share with you my experiences growing up in Lenox Street projects, that's South and Lower Roxbury. My family was the sixth person who moved into Lenox Street in 1939. And during my presentation, I will talk about Doris Bunty, who was a TA president who turned everything around. And because of her, BHA went into receivership. And now for her decision, it was better for it. So next slide, please. Sorry about that. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb, but obviously it didn't work.
No worries at all, Mrs. Brown.
The federal public housing program started with the passing of the 1937 Housing Act, initially intended for jobs program, slums clearance initiative. Public housing was a result of strong grassroots organizing. Next slide. Boston Housing Authority was founded October of 1935. The Board of Commissioners were formed by the mayor and the city council in October of 1935. It was managed and controlled by an administrator who was appointed and serves at the pleasure of the mayor of the city of Boston. Next slide. Building of Boston public housing. Public housing was being built in Boston at a rapid pace during 1945 to 1954. In 1954, Boston stopped building public housing for families while the rest of the country continued building developments for families. The first development was built in South Boston, Mary Ellen McCormick, in May of 1938. Pre-war housing was closed in and away from suburbs or neighborhoods that had a non-white majority. Lenox Street was for Blacks, Bunker Hill and Charlestown, Mary Ellen McCormick, Old Colony, and Mission Hill were for whites. Next slide. Lenox Street projects was developed around 1939. Lenox Street was built for Blacks. Screening or vetting, if you will, was very restrictive. Only 50 to 80% of the people that applied, only 2 to 12% were accepted. The rest was considered high-risk undesirables. All of the applicants who were accepted would have to have been a two-person head of household, widows with children, and no single mothers. Next slide.
Really quickly, we do have some photos too that we want to share with the coming slides. So I'm just going to prep my screen for that. We'll start with this one. And
Yes. The Dockett family lived on Kendall Street, and they moved into Lenox Street. And they asked that she provide a waiver and authorization to take photos. And of course, this was a handwritten waiver that she had to write. And I have some visuals of the Dockett family before moving into Lenox Street. Could I see those, please, of the Dockett family at 45 Kendall? No, that's the first tenant association of Lenox Street.
I do have some of the pictures from online pulled up too to see if we can find them, because I don't know if I have that one in the stack. Is it in this one?
Yes, right here. You see the woman and the son standing at the stove. That was 45 Kendall Street. And those were the conditions. The stove was fueled by coal, and the bathrooms, they were shared in a hallway with other families. And so the next slide will show her moving into Lenox Street with the, no, that's not it.
Sorry, I thought I had all of the pictures pulled up, but I think I had them out of order, so I apologize.
Yeah. No, keep going. There's Mrs. Dockett. Can you go right here? That's in her new Lenox Street project apartment. You see the porcelain stove and the sink and the porcelain refrigerator. And I wish you could see the bathroom. They had porcelain commodes, and there was just so much pride taken. And if you slide down, you will see some other families there as well who were enjoying the benefits. Well, those are the suits walking along Lenox Street housing projects. And we insisted on their maintaining some of the trees. Go ahead with some more slides, please. Keep sliding down. There's another family that's now in was in Lenox Street in 1939. And you can see her fine china and the two little girls playing. And more visuals, please.
I think that's it in
Okay,
this
but
one.
if you go back further to the top, to the first one, keep going. All right, no, keep going. Up, keep going. I wanted to show the tenant association, the first tenant association.
Oh, yes, I have that one over
Okay.
here. Thank you for being patient.
I'm so proud of this photo because my mother's in there. And she was in charge of education and home ownership and summer youth program. And they worked very well. And if you notice, all the ladies dressed with hats and hosiery and just looking very nicely, you know, for the tenant association meeting. And of course, the men were absent because they were working, and some of these women were stay at home. There's two there that was a school teacher and one was a nurse. So the next slide, please. And I also wanted to add that each tenant was responsible for cleaning his or her building. And we had to sweep and maintain the building. We had schedules. We had schedules when we could wash our clothes and hang them up in the clothespin. So it was very organized. All of the residents followed the rules and the place was immaculate. Now the slide of the visual that you're looking at now was our swimming pool. And it wasn't really a swimming pool. It was a hole of maybe 3 inches at the most. And they had water hoses. And we were in ninth heaven because we just thought we were a bag of chips and all of that. But it was just a wonderful experience for us that we had a place in our backyard in the summertime where we can enjoy cooling down. Okay, next slide, please.
Pictures, right? Not the PowerPoint.
We can go with the slides. Thank you, because the pictures are out of order at this point. The slum clearance slides. This was the pre-Section 3 opportunities, clearing of Lenox Street. Now I want to show these. They had a diverse construction crew. And could I see the next photo of the, that's afterwards. That's Lenox Street. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. This is beginning of the slum clearance. And the next slide. Take a note of this. You see these young people dressed so nicely and walking through all that trash? Well, Roxbury was one of the city dumps, unofficial. A lot of towns from the suburbs would come to Roxbury and dump their trash on the streets of Roxbury. It was just horrible. And my parents and other people there got involved with NAACP and other officials to make it stop. And lawsuits prevailed, and they had an official dump out at Columbia Point. There was one for the city and one that was private, but we said this had to stop. Next visual, please. You see the streets there lined with trash. They would just come and just dump their trash. Next visual, please. Now in South Boston during the same time, you see how clean the streets were. They didn't have that issue. Everybody deemed it necessary to dump their trash in Roxbury. The next visual, please. Even the slum conditions in South Boston, they were not subjected to that type of debris surrounding their home. Next visual.
I believe that's the last one, but I can pull up the website again with the pictures
Okay.
if that's helpful.
Next slide, please.
Mhm. Oh, we talked about that one already.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay. There were 7 federal post-war developments and 10 state developments. And public housing was met with so much pride and celebration. The way it was touted in the newspapers, public housing was going to make the sun come out the next day. Everybody was so excited and so supportive. Next slide, please. Commonwealth Development built in Brighton in 1951. The Commonwealth Development was the last farm in rural Boston. This land was used for this development. It was dubbed as integrated. It had 97% white and 3% Black. There were 648 apartments, 6-story elevated buildings, and 3-story walk-ups. Next slide. Columbia Point was built in 1954, and it was the last family public housing development built. The next family development built was West Newton in 1973. And Columbia Point had 1,504 apartments, initially mostly white. And it was built next to New England's largest dump, one city dump and one private dump. Next slide. Boston Housing Authority's emission policy challenge. Policies impacted single moms, did not receive the same benefits as white residents. Home ownership in other places were not shared. Housing was built in the suburbs to address the needs of returning veterans, but Black veterans were not allowed to buy in other areas of Boston and suburbs due to redlining and so forth. Pressure was mounting from civil rights groups, lawsuits, etc. Next slide, please. Boston Housing Authority revised the emission statement. Policies were revised to accommodate those applicants that were previously rejected: single moms, one person head of household, and those deemed undesirable. Mayor White created a tenant-oriented majority board. There was a TA president, Doris Bunty from Orchard Park. There was a labor leader, Julius Bernstein, and a public housing tenant, John Conley, who was also a Harvard student. Next slide. Mayor White creates tenant orientation majority board. The board believed they could reform public housing. Board wanted 100% public housing, did not favor mixed income. Dan Flynn, who was the executive director of BHA, did not support their goals and/or plans. The tenant board fired the ED, Dan Flynn, the mayor's appointee, on national television. Next slide. Decline of Boston Housing Authority. Mayor White retaliated against Doris Bunty with trumped up fraud charges. The charges were overturned. So questions were raised. Whose voices matter? What were the roles of residents? What was the role of the Boston Housing Authority? Next slide.
And really quickly, I know we only have 2 minutes left, but again, we're going to go over a little bit for folks who want to hop off. Just know that we'll be recording this section as well.
Boston Housing Authority goes into receivership. Mayor White lost interest in BHA. Everything spiraled downward. There was no maintenance in common areas. There were frozen pipes in the hallways, no trash pickup, no heat. It was just horrible. Occupancy declined 60%. Vacancies declined 30 to 50%. In 1979, Judge Paul Garrity took a tour through the Boston Housing Lenox Street projects because he wanted to see for himself before he ruled on their lawsuit. And as a result, Judge Garrity ordered BHA into receivership. Next slide. Lewis H. Spence, known as Harry Spence, appointed receiver BHA. In 1980, Harry Spence, 33 years old, was appointed to oversee the fourth largest housing authority at that time. There were two different models, Columbia Point in Dorchester and Commonwealth in Brighton. Commonwealth remained 100% public housing by contract due to Doris Bunty and the tenant majority board. Columbia Point was redeveloped to Harbor Point, mixed income. Next slide, please. Lewis H. Spence, receiver. In 1980, Judge Garrity suspended BHA's governing board. BHA had a deficit of $5 million and housing stock of 67 public developments and shocking physical decay. Receiver Spence brought BHA into compliance. Next slide. Boston Housing Authority receivership expired in 1990. In 1990, BHA is compliant and receivership is ended. has a new administrator, and the mayor appointed a 9-member monitoring committee who reviews the administrator's activities. The monitoring committee is appointed by the mayor and reports to the mayor. Next slide. BHA moves forward with choice neighbor initiatives and RAD programs. Choice Neighborhoods Initiative grants in 2018 was used to build the Whittier Street projects, and that was built in 1953. They just replaced 200 units with 509 units of mixed income, 14,225 square feet of commercial space, and it was completed. It started in 2018, it was completed in 2021. Next slide, please. Boston Housing Authority RAD programs. BHA currently manages 10,802 units and 21,414 people. BHA mixed income, 1,915 units and 4,949 people. And manages Section 8, or 27,073 units and 33,399 people. Now, their housing choice voucher units, 12,216 units with 29,166 people. And that was as of 2021. And the project-based voucher units, 1,441 with 2,483 people. And mod rehab units, they have 198 with units and 542 people. And the residents seem to be very happy. And the reason being is because these various RAD programs are diverse. You have all of your different people of color and whites moving in and living amongst each other. And it appears to be working as of this point. You know, there's always room for improvement, but they have managed to communicate their needs with each other and to the Housing Authority. The Housing Authority tends to listen. Next slide. And these are the various federal units, but they have the state, project-based elderly, project-based family, mod rehab elderly, and mod rehab family. Next slide. And my resources were the Boston Housing Authority 2021 Annual Plan, the Boston Housing Authority Archives, BHA Dwelling Unit Summary, and Lawrenceville MIT Fort Urban Design and Planning, and the MIT Library, the City of Boston Library, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. But what I wanted to add about Doris Bunty, when Kevin White fired her in 1971, she was reinstated in 1973 by the Massachusetts Supreme Court. In 1984, she ran for state representative and she won. She was the first Black female to hold office. And she served there for 12 years and then she left to become the executive director of BHA. And unfortunately, she died last year. But while she was there at BHA, she turned things around. She created green policies. She helped the homeless, took care of the trash issues, and created jobs. She was just an incredible woman. And I just want to share with the residents, when you have an agreement with a housing authority, you tell them what you want. And she was adamant about 100% public housing. She wanted that, and she got it. And still to this day, Commonwealth is 100% public housing. And it's all about us working together and making a difference. And Bill McGonigal, he served as executive director from 2009 to 2019. He started out at BHA as a janitor. He was born in Mary Ellen McCormick Housing Development, and he worked his way up all the way to executive director. And he was one of the better EDs because he's lived there as a resident. He had experiences as a resident, and he knew the difficulty. There was a couple of occasions where some of his fellows South Boston residents threw eggs at his house, vandalized his car because he was supporting diversity. He was supporting all of the residents. So it's about leadership. It's about coming together and making a difference. We can do it. Just remember that it's up to us. Thank you very much for listening and allowing me to share my fond memories at Boston Housing Authority Lenox Street projects.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Brown, for sharing and helping us learn a little bit of history about the Boston Housing Authority, but also of your life. It takes vulnerability to share that, so I really appreciate it. And again, I know we went a little bit over time, but I'm not sure if there's any questions that came in. A lot of folks just giving you kudos and appreciating what you shared, loving the photos, and we'll share the photos too with folks. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll share this recording with everybody. Thank you to Jackson, to Ramona, and for Mrs. Brown for all the wonderful information that you all shared.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you
for joining us.
Thank you everyone for participating and staying over. I appreciate it.
Yeah, super appreciate y'all taking extra time. But again, if you ever have any questions, if you want to join and be a panelist or have any topic ideas, feel free to always email me. And we also have a Facebook page that you can join, and I'll put that in the chat, but I'll also put it in the follow-up email so y'all don't have to stay extra time for that. But I appreciate you all, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, and you will receive the PowerPoints, folks. I know I just saw that in the chat, but you will receive those. Awesome. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next month. It'll be July 11th because we'll be out for the July 4th weekend, but we'll see you July 11th. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.